Hi everyone, it's just gone 3 o'clock. Welcome to the third Political Studies Association Teaching and Learning Network webinar on teaching politics online. My name's Donna Smith from the Open University and I'm co-chair of the Teaching and Learning Network. Most universities have had to move their teaching offer online due to the current coronavirus pandemic, and this has led to various challenges you're no doubt familiar with, such as getting to grips with technology, understanding online teaching, and creating an academic community at a distance, as well as some opportunities such as the chance to do things differently, build on best practice, and reach students asynchronously. Now the immediate, what we've called crisis response phase has passed. We thought it's a good idea to to reflect on best practice in teaching online, as it's possible that many of us will do more of this in the future, either in response to the pandemic or because our teaching and learning models and student needs change. So today's session is called What Campus Universities Can Learn from Online Distance Ones by Georgina Blakeley from the University of Huddersfield. The session will cover what can be done to just get by when moving teaching online in a hurry, but it will also then move on to talk about some of the longer term lessons that we can learn from Georgina's experience of distance learning. So we're due to finish in about an hour's time, and there will be time for questions at the end. My colleague John Craig, co-chair of the PSA Teaching and Learning Network, will be moderating the chat, so do post any questions there. And Jamie Roberts from the PSA is also on hand in case we have any technical issues. Please note the session's recorded and please make sure you're muted for now. So okay, to get started, please welcome Georgina.
Okay, thanks Donna, and thanks everybody for coming to listen to this session that I hope will be useful for you, and particular thanks because I can see outside that it's a nice sunny day where I am, and it would probably be nice to go and enjoy some of that sunshine. This question about what campus universities can learn from distance learning counterparts was really on my mind because I've spent the last sort of 13 years at the Open University working with Donna amongst other colleagues, and just over a year ago I moved to the University of Huddersfield. So kind of prior to the COVID crisis, this question had very much been on my mind, and indeed was actually something that I kind of thought about when I was going for my current post at Huddersfield and thinking about questions that might be put to me about the learning that I got from the Open University and how that learning could be relevant or could be transferred to a campus university. And I guess in the interview itself, I was worried because in some ways we know that the Open University is a unique institution within the UK higher education sector. It's unique in terms of its size. It's the largest university in the UK. In terms of its scale, it's the only university in the UK that covers the 4 nations. Its mission is distinctive, its mission of social justice, and of course its student body is also distinctive. So that kind of question was really on my mind as I was going for my interview at Huddersfield. But also what was on my mind was the fact that the differences, I think, between the Open University and other institutions in the UK are to some extent overplayed. And I was thinking particularly here of the likenesses, the similarities between the student bodies. And this is particularly relevant to Huddersfield, so, and probably other post-92 universities, so it might not be relevant to all of your institutions. But when I began sort of thinking about the student bodies, both at the Open University and Huddersfield, there are actually more similarities than differences. So just looking at that table kind of shows you actually that there are a lot of similarities between the 2 types of students. So OU students, a lot of them are part-time, obviously, but increasingly many study at full-time intensity. Whereas at Huddersfield, in some ways, it's the other way around. So on paper, at least, most of them are full-time, but many of them combine their studies with part-time work, carrying responsibilities. So in some ways, they act very much like part-time students. OU students obviously study at a distance. Huddersfield students are supposed to be on campus, and we do have an attendance monitoring policy. But many of our students, about 2/3 of them, are commuter students. So that means that in some ways they behave like distance learning students. They find it difficult to be on campus, and when they're on campus, we find it difficult to retain them. We talk a lot about a sticky campus, but in reality, it's not very sticky, and many of our students find it difficult to come in and participate as fully as they would like. Like many Open University students, students at Huddersfield come from IMD 1 and 2 backgrounds, so the most deprived communities in the UK. Unlike the Open University, of course, we do have entry requirements, but many come in with BTECs and lower prior educational qualifications. So again, there's quite a bit of similarity between at least student bodies from each institution. So that got me again sort of thinking about the lessons that I'd learned at the Open University and how I could translate them into that kind of campus context. Little did I know how useful that kind of thinking was going to be. And of course, with the current crisis, it's become extremely pertinent.
Okay.
Can I continue? Okay. It's become really pertinent to think about those lessons, and they've become much less philosophical, if you like, and much more practical. So what I've done for the purposes of this presentation is to think about 10 kind of overarching principles for blended teaching and learning, which comes from that Open University experience. So it's all about the blend. This was something that it was a bit of a catchphrase of mine at the Open University, not the least when we were being pushed at the Open University to put everything online. And the argument of myself and many other colleagues was actually online only is no good, and the blend itself is absolutely key. And that's the rationale for this, is because of course there's no such thing as the typical student. You know, students have differing abilities, needs, interests, preferred learning styles, and the blend is absolutely key to cater to those different needs. The blend, I think it's important to say though, is not just in terms of teaching materials. You know, I think we often think about the blend of teaching materials, whether we're teaching in face-to-face situations or at a distance, but it's also important in terms of learning activities and in terms of student support. And I'll come back to the student support issue later on. So think about the different teaching materials that you can use, whether that's videos, audios, quizzes, online activities, and how they're put together in a way that allows students to have the best learning environment. And importantly, and this is particularly pertinent, I think, where you have students like at the University of Huddersfield who may struggle with IT equipment, may struggle to have internet access, or indeed may not want to study online for much of the time. Think about what students can do offline as well as online. And I think that's really important, you know, particularly, as I say, for those kind of widening participation students, to think about those students as much as you can. The second principle, I'm sure you've heard a lot about this already, and that is the principle of chunking. It's not a very elegant word, but I think it sums up kind of what needs to be done here. And the rationale for this is, of course, that attention spans, we know they're quite reduced in face-to-face environments. I think we tend to think that students listen well for the first 20 minutes or so and then switch off till we kind of bring them back in again. Well, in the online environments, the attention spans are much more reduced. So think about chunking video materials, think about audio, think about chunking text as much as possible. So, you know, you really need to think about the length and type of materials that are provided to students. Many of you may be thinking about using your lecture capture from previous years. In fact, your institutions might be saying this is the kind of, at least the practical thing to do in the meantime. And it might be unavoidable. I think in all of this, we need to think about, to distinguish between the doable and the desirable. So if you are having to reuse lecture capture, think about how it can be divided up, think about how it can be chunked, and think also about how it can be topped and tailed with learning activities. I would say it is desirable to avoid simply reusing lecture capture from previous years, but if that's what you have to do, then do think about dividing it up and topping and tailing it with activities so students can get the most from it, rather than just having a passive kind of learning experience of watching the lecture capture as it was captured in previous years. And that brings me to the third principle of engagement. This is kind of one of my favourite points really about thinking about OU materials. I always used to say to colleagues at the Open University that it's when we kind of make and produce OU materials, it's a bit like giving toys to children. You're never quite sure what they're going to do with them, and it's probably not what you originally intended. And that's pretty much the same when you're giving teaching materials to students. There's absolutely no guarantee that students will engage with the materials that you provide in the way that you want them to. And that's something that you need to bear in mind. And it's also worth thinking about, you know, all the time and resource that you invest into your teaching materials. They might be the best teaching materials in the world, but if you're not thinking about how to get students to engage with them, you run the risk of kind of wasting the time and resources that you've invested. And of course, what we want students to do is to watch, to read, to listen actively rather than passively. And we need to kind of think about ways in which we can get students to do that. So again, think very much around activities. What activities can you provide to get students to engage with the materials? That might be as simple as an activity where you get students where you pose a number of questions before students are watching a lecture or watching 15 minutes of a video, and get students to watch out for those questions, to jot down some ideas in response to them, so that when they're sitting down in front of a lecture or a video, they're looking for something, they're ready to engage, they're watching out for those points that they need to jot down that will help their understanding. And those kind of prompts, if you like, or sort of prompting questions, really help students to listen actively rather than to kind of lean back in their chair and engage passively. And I think that kind of leads on to a wider point, really, that we have to, just as we're all kind of learning how to put our teaching materials online and to think about that sort of blended environment, we also need to teach students how to do that as well. So we need to think about the tips, about the guidance, about the advice we can provide for students so that they get the most out of studying online, because we can't expect them suddenly to be in this unfamiliar environment and to know what to do with it. So the Open University, for example, invests a lot of time and resource invests a lot of time into producing resources that teach students how to be distance learning students. So I think that's something that we need to think about doing as we all move our teaching online as well. Tone and voice is really important, and I guess what we need to sort of think about here is that when the Open University is producing a module, they spend about 2 years doing that, and within that 2 years, a lot of the learning that takes place for the academics producing the materials is around getting the tone and voice right for students. We don't, of course, have that luxury, but there are some things that we can think about doing. And the reason that tone and voice is so important is that what's lacking in an online environment are those kind of social cues. And I'm finding that now as I'm presenting, as I'm sure that many of you will also have this experience. I'm concentrating on the PowerPoint. I can only see a handful of videos of people that are attending this session. And so I'm missing out on those social cues that you get from being in front of a lecture, being in a seminar group. You get much more sort of back from the audience. Presenting in Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever the online platform is a bit like talking into a vacuum. And so that means that you really need to think about tone and voice and getting that right for students, because otherwise it's very difficult to know where students might be going wrong, where there might be misunderstanding, where there might be misinterpretation. So whether you're delivering in terms of video and audio, or whether you're using text. Think carefully about the words you use to convey your messages. Try and speak in plain English. Try to avoid colloquialisms. That's particularly important if you have a high percentage of international students, of course, as well. But keep the instructions as clear as possible. When you're asking students to watch something, to do an activity, to engage with something, keep the instructions as simple, consistent, and as courteous as possible. The fifth principle is to maintain a presence. And by that I mean sort of thinking, if you're learning at a distance, if you're learning online, it can be a very lonely experience. And this, I think, is particularly pertinent for new students who will have had no prior contact with their teaching staff. For our students who are continuing, at least they have the benefit of knowing who you are. They've had interaction with you already. But for new students, they won't have had the benefit of that. So at the very least, make sure you have your photo uploaded so they can see who you are. And avoid that terrible kind of blacked out sort of grey robotic profile that you can see on the screen there. It really is important that students know what you look like. I know many people don't like to put up their photo. They like to put up a flower or an animal or something instead, and I do understand that. But I think for students in this environment, it really is important that they know what you look like, because that helps them to make that kind of connection. Think also about how you can use drop-ins, weekly emails, discussion boards, whatever it might be, to maintain that presence online for students. And think as well about how you might use social media to build more informal connections with students. I'm not particularly good at using social media. I'll kind of put my hands up to that. I do know that the Open University is very good in the way in which it uses social media in quite an informal way, whether that's via Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might be. So I think it's worth thinking about that, particularly if you have colleagues who are comfortable in that environment. Think about how you can use that to build informal connections with students. One example that the OU used to do that I used to like myself was Friday Thinker on Facebook, which involved an academic posing a question on a Friday that was sometimes a bit controversial, sometimes a bit provocative, monitoring the chat during the day and getting students to engage with that question. It was always a question that you didn't particularly need knowledge for, so students could kind of operate from a position of confidence, but it was a nice way of having interaction with students that otherwise is often quite difficult when they're at a distance. And it was, for the academic concerned, it wasn't a huge workload. There was a kind of weekly rota, and academics used to take part sort of once every 6 months. But for the students, it was a regular slot when they knew they could interact with an academic on a particular topic of interest. And that brings me to number 6, which is about structuring interaction. I think it's important to remember that students will be at a distance not just from their lecturers, from their tutors, they'll also be at a distance from each other. So they'll miss out on that kind of very informal sense of support they get from each other, whether that's sort of just coming out at the end of a lecture thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't understand any of that, did you? That's the kind of support that they will miss out on when they're in this blended learning environment. So we need to think about how we can provide structured ways of almost kind of imitating that sense of connectedness that they get in a face-to-face environment. Of course, it can be very awkward. So that is why I think it's important to think about how you structure it. You can't really leave it to chance. You can't really leave it to spontaneity. You need to kind of think about the opportunities that you might provide for students so that they can engage with each other. And I think linked to that is it's also important to establish codes of conduct for students. I think we tend to think, and I'm certainly guilty of this, that kind of younger students are very good at interacting online. And we think there's kind of a digital generation. But actually, I think what we find, particularly as soon as we kind of translate that into an academic setting, students find it very hard to see how the skills that they use on WhatsApp or whatever, TikTok, whatever the latest kind of online environment is, they don't see how they transfer those skills over into an academic setting. And I think often misunderstandings can arise amongst each other unless we provide kind of codes of conduct, a kind of netiquette, if you like, I think is important to establish. Otherwise, it can get quite difficult for students, I think. And I keep with the theme of structuring. I think it's really important to structure students' learning journeys. And again, because it comes back to this idea that in an online environment, it's much harder for the lecturer to know what students might be grasping or not understanding, because we miss out on those kind of cues that we would get face to face. So that means, and I'm sure that you're all kind of finding this at the moment and grappling with this, distance learning to work well requires a lot of upfront investment, both in time and resources. So any time that you can manage to invest now will be time well spent. Think about the learning journey for a student up front. Ensure that you're allowing space for students to revisit, practice, extend and reinforce content and skills. Really try and think about that, not just at a module level, but also at a program level, which I think can be hard for face-to-face institutions to do sometimes. Try and think about it in terms of a route map, and I think timings are very important here. Try and think about how long it will take students to do activities, to do readings, to watch sections of videos, and with those timings, try and provide an ideal route map for students to follow through the teaching materials that you're providing. Of course, students won't necessarily follow that route map, but at least it's there to give students a sense of direction if they want it. The OU, of course, uses a study calendar, which I think is helpful to think of that as something that kind of mirrors a timetable. If you think about a timetable in the kind of physical face-to-face environment, that is what structures a student's learning experience. So think about how you provide that timetable, even though you might not be timetabling face-to-face sessions. Think about how you could provide that timetable in a kind of study calendar format, which structures for a student, sets out what they need to do and when they need to do it. And I think that can be helpful for students to give them that sort of sense of structure. Principle 7 is about consistency. And that's because, to kind of follow on from the point that I've made, that there's no such thing as a digital generation. We tend to assume that, today's students will be very familiar with online environments, will be very comfortable in them. I think when it comes to an academic setting, that's not necessarily the case. And students may find that online environments, whether you use Moodle, Blackboard, Brightspace, whatever it might be, they can be very unfamiliar. They can seem very overloaded and very overwhelming for students, particularly if you are putting a lot of content in there. Students can quickly become overwhelmed and not know what's important and what's less important. So consistency, I think, becomes very important within that context. So students need consistency in terms of delivering teaching online. They need to know what our expectations are. They need consistency in terms of layouts, how things are presented, and what we are requiring students to do. So if you have a program with, say, 6 different modules in each year of study, try and ensure that those modules are consistent in the way that they're doing things, whether that's online, offline. Make sure that that consistency is there. And of course, you know, if we had sort of more time, and this might not be possible, but really think about how you scaffold skills, content and assessment, and talk as Biggs would have us think in terms of the alignment of materials, outcomes and assessment. The more time that you can invest in that at the moment will help that online experience later on. Right, this is kind of comes to sort of the desirable, I guess, rather than the doable. For those of you who kind of haven't had the experience of an OU module team, it's rather hard to explain. It can be a wonderful process, a very creative process. It can be also an immensely frustrating and difficult process to go through. Probably the best way of describing it is to imagine that you sit around with your colleagues, get all your lecture notes in a pile, and your colleagues then go through your lecture notes line by line and tell you different ways of doing things. So it can be incredibly frustrating as well as creative, as I've said. Whilst we can't imitate that within the sort of the face-to-face setting, I do think it's important to think about how useful critical peer review can be, because that helps students to see their studies holistically rather than on a module by module basis. My sense is, kind of having moved from the OU to a campus university, that at a campus university, colleagues tend to think much more in terms of their own modules that they're delivering. And whilst there is a view of how those modules fit together in the programme, I think it's quite easy to lose sight of that overall programme experience, as kind of, you know, colleagues rightly concentrate on their module and the teaching that they need to do for that particular module. So I think it's useful to always remember to take that step back and think, well, okay, how does this module and how I'm delivering it in a blended environment fit with other modules that a student might be doing? And we need to kind of take that step back for students, I think. And to write good distance learning materials, it's really helpful to have that critical peer review. I don't think it's something that you can do as easily on your own. You can do it on your own, but I think it's beneficial to have somebody to look over your materials, the things that you're writing, the things that you're producing, so the end result is much richer. Because it's very much an iterative process that really does benefit from that element of critical peer review. However uncomfortable that might be at times for us to do, I do think the end result will be better. So one thing that you might want to think about doing within your own context is to think about a buddying or a mentor system for staff. So as you're kind of producing your online materials, converting perhaps existing lecturers and providing those wraparound activities, get a colleague who perhaps teaches on the same programme to look at what you're doing, so you can kind of both get advice and guidance from somebody else, but also enrich each other's materials. And principle 9 is about how, again, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot over the last few weeks, in the sense that I think at a campus face-to-face university, the teaching element, kind of what academics do, seems to be much more separate from sort of the wraparound student support services. Whereas I think in a blended learning setting, and I'd be interested to see what people think about this actually, because I may well be wrong, but my sense is that in a blended learning setting, you know, teaching at a distance, teaching and support is much more intertwined. And that's, I think, because online teaching materials are not only there to provide content and skills, they're also providing support. And that, you know, to come back to a point I made earlier, that's why tone and voice is so important. Because when you're kind of designing an activity or you're writing text that a student will be reading, it's almost like you have a lecturer kind of sat at your side as you're reading it. So the teaching materials are there kind of acting as a guiding voice, the lecturer in the room, if you like, that you would have in the face-to-face environment. So that's why I think the teaching materials themselves become part of the support framework for students. So that support that we provide is done through structuring the materials, scaffolding, and really thinking carefully about the way materials are presented and the tone and voice that you're using in those materials. And also think here, if you remember right at the start, I talked about the importance of the blend, not just in terms of the teaching and learning materials, but also in terms of support tools, because one kind of support tool won't meet the needs of all your different students. So think about something like a quick start guide. This is something that I designed at the Open University for entry-level students. And it was based really on the idea of thinking about what everybody does when you get a new kind of electronic device. You know, nobody kind of goes and looks through the very detailed technical guidance. Everybody picks up the quick start guide so they can get going as soon as possible. And I think it's important to have something like that for students who will be moving into this new environment. So particularly important, of course, for new students starting in September and October. Think about providing a quick start guide in hard copy so students can get up and running in the online environment as quickly as possible. Think as well about the telephone call. I know we tend to kind of think everything should be done in Zoom or whatever it might be these days, but actually a simple pick up the phone telephone call can go a long way in terms of supporting students, not the least because it shows that somebody at the institution to which they're going has actually cared enough to pick up the phone and ask them about what kind of support they might need, talk through their expectations before they start studying, and to ensure that they're kind of, you know, ready to go as soon as term starts. And then obviously think about online induction sessions, discussion boards that can be both synchronous and asynchronous. We're trialling at Huddersfield with some student groups online peer mentoring from this September. And think about as well how you can, as I've talked a bit about already, about how you can build online communities through social media. I think there's no, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's no magic bullet for any of this. You know, I think the Open University, who's been doing it for 50 years now, would probably say they've not really cracked it yet. So, you know, it's something that you have to keep chipping away at, thinking of different things to do, and providing different support for students in different ways. So the last tips, plan spontaneity, which of course is a contradiction in terms. But I think what I was thinking here as a kind of summing up point is that, and I've sort of touched on this already to some extent, is that blended delivery, teaching online, teaching at a distance, removes the ability to act and react in the moment. You know, those kind of situations when you're in a face-to-face teaching session where you can react to whatever students are coming back with, whether it's sort of misunderstanding, whether it's you're needing to make sure that the group gels, you know, all that kind of reaction and action is missing in that sort of online context. So you need to plan for it, hence the contradiction in terms of planning spontaneity. So plan, and plan again would be my advice. Plan both formal and informal learning opportunities. Plan for a series of touch points with your students, whether that's you as a lecturer kind of in your teaching context, or you as a lecturer as a personal academic tutor. Really think and plan for those different touch points with students and how you can, the different modes within which you can do them. Think about drop-in sessions at different times. Think about the support you might want to provide around assignments, assignment clinics, for example. And I suppose actually I can think of another principle, but don't worry, I won't go on and invent an 11th one. But think as well in terms of assessment as a support mechanism. Assessment, I think, in an online environment is much more about assessment for learning than it is assessment of learning. So think about how you can facilitate assignments and assessment support to ensure that that happens. And I shall end there. I think that's probably more than enough to think about for now.
Thanks,
Okay.
Georgina. Thank you all for your questions as well. I'll now hand over to my colleague John, who's been moderating the chat box, who'll speak to Georgina about some of your questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Donna and Georgina. There's been quite a few questions. I'm sure more will come through as we chat. But let's start off with the first one from Sergio, who's asking about GDPR. And what are the GDPR pitfalls associated with recording online small group seminars where students are recorded and whose interventions will be transcribed? I was wondering if you could talk about some of your experience with GDPR issues there.
At this point, I'm going to smile at Donna because I think it took the Open University about 2 years to actually come up with a policy of recording tutorials. It can be a minefield, and I think what you I don't think there's a kind of magic answer to this, and it'd be interesting to hear what other colleagues think as well. And I think the balance is always between thinking about the type of session and whether the real purpose is information giving, which I think dictates one policy. It's much easier to record when it's much more about information giving. If your purpose of the session is about encouraging interaction, particularly among students with low confidence, then I think you do another thing in terms of recording. And for those kind of sessions, I would advise not recording. So I suppose, you know, think about the purpose of your session and whether or not recording is appropriate. You also have to weigh up accessibility issues too. And of course, where recording really comes into its own is for students with disabilities, students who may not be able to, for whatever reason, access the synchronous session as it happens. So there isn't a, sorry, I'm kind of failing to give a nice simple answer to this question, but that's because it's complex. It would be remiss of me to just say, in this situation, do this. I think it is about thinking about those different factors and what's most important out of those factors in any given context. I don't know, Donna, whether you want to kind of come in there from an OU perspective, because I do remember about 2 years of agonising discussions about this.
Yeah, well, we're still having agonising discussions. We're nearly there. We're currently kind of creating a kind of the policy kind of Mark II to reflect things that have happened. I mean, the issues that we have had to consider with the recording policy, and I think we have to consider as well, one of the kind of the key features of the OU is the level of scale. You know, we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of students, so it's kind of a really big issue. But issues we had to consider are, as Georgina said, the different types of sessions, lecture versus seminar, teaching versus drop-in, student opinion. We have a very strong student body and kind of a representative body. Our kind of lecturer opinion. We have a very strong union presence and very strong tutor body. The legal stuff, not just GDPR, but performing rights. How long the material can be hosted on the website for, can it roll over from 1 year to another? You know, who owns the material, all of this stuff. So, you know, so it takes a long while to get a formal policy in place. And I think ultimately you have to try and come up with something which benefits the students. That's kind of the key thing. But also you have to take into account the different positions of the faculties. You know, some faculties are very seminar based, other faculties are kind of much more lecture based. So to get something which works across the whole board means there will have to be compromises. And I think the students have to compromise, the lecturers do, the faculties do. But it takes a long while to get something formal, and GDPR is just the start of it, really, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, it's good to know, I guess, that the discussions are still going on at the OU. I do know at Huddersfield that this issue was raised, obviously, as we're kind of moving teaching online, and the response from our PVC teaching and learning was that they were going to look at the recording policy that already exists for lecture capture via Panopto and look at adapting that. but I kind of smiled to myself because they made it sound so easy, and I thought, my OU experience, it's not going to be that easy, but let's see what happens. But that's certainly the starting point for Huddersfield. So in terms of everybody's else's institutions, that might be a starting point for you to look at what the recording policy is that you have already for lecture capture, where you use that, and then go from there. Okay,
Georgina, I'll stick on a couple more questions around student experience and supporting students for now. The question raised by Thomas Ron around students who and staff who are autistic, who may find internet teaching difficult. I wonder, perhaps maybe framing it more broadly, can you talk us through some of the issues around supporting students with disabilities in online learning?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm very mindful that there are new accessibility new accessibility legislation that is coming into force from this September. So it is very important to think and to get advice from your disability services, for example, around subtitling lectures and any kind of videos you might be doing, providing transcripts for audios, and thinking very seriously about alternative formats. And I guess it comes back to that overarching principle about the blend. You know, you can't rely on just one source to provide your teaching and learning materials, not just from a pedagogical point of view, but also from that disability point of view. So you do need to try and think of those different issues and barriers that students will face. And we're very mindful, as I said at Huddersfield, that, you know, many of our students in this transition online have suffered dreadfully because they do not have either the necessary IT equipment, they don't have appropriate internet access, and many certainly don't have an appropriate study space. You know, they're in a house with siblings and relatives, and, you know, finding it very difficult to find that study space. So we need to be mindful of all of that, even if there aren't necessarily easy solutions to it. In terms of kind of thinking about how students might kind of interact within that online environment, I think one thing that I learned certainly from the Open University was to value all kinds of interaction and not have a preconceived notion about what would be good participation and good interaction. Because not all students, for whatever reason, it might be to do with disability, it might be to do with something entirely different, to do with confidence levels or something like that, not all students will be able to, nor will want to participate by using the microphone, for example. And it can be very difficult to manage. What you will find, as we've found here, no doubt, is that the chat box is extremely busy. You know, so that's something to think about when you're thinking about delivery. It's very hard to do a delivery in terms of kind of a presentation whilst monitoring the chat box at the same time. So if you can double up and have, you know, pairs of presenters, that's really helpful. But learn to value the chat as interaction. You know, you can interact in many different ways, not just by using the microphone. Value as well something as simple as kind of getting people to react. So, you know, put a smiley face, clap, applaud. All those things I think are really useful, and a really kind of useful technique, I think, to kind of break up that sort of monotony of a lecture capture, as it were, is if you're kind of using that, break it up by sort of every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, just say to students, you know, let's give me a thumbs up if you're still with me, you know, an applause if you thought that was good, or a thumbs down if you haven't a clue what I'm talking about, and sort of value those kind of little reactions as an interaction, as a sort of sign that students are engaging. And certainly don't think because students aren't talking, aren't actively, you know, talking in that way we might expect in the seminar space, that they're not engaging. They probably are, but just in a very different way to what we might be used to.
Okay, if I move on maybe to a couple of questions now around the teaching and learning experience, we'll jump back to some of the others. But Rose raised a question. Is it realistic to try and cover the same quantity of content in an online environment? Or should we focus more, if you like, on self-directed learning for students to pick up content and focus our work online more towards getting interaction going? What are your thoughts on that, Georgina?
No, absolutely. Again, you know, kind of using Adobe Connect, which is what the Open University uses to teach online, it became apparent very quickly that you can't get through the same amounts that you would in a face-to-face day school, for example. So you do get through much less material. If you're delivering, sorry, I should clarify, if you're delivering a synchronous session online, you get through much less material. And that's because you have to chunk it. And that's because you also have to have that check-in mechanism to make sure students are with you. You know, I didn't do that throughout this presentation, which actually was very bad kind of, you know, pedagogy on my part. You know, I should have stopped after sort of slide 4 or 5 and said to everyone, hey guys, are you okay? Give me a thumbs up. But in my defense, it's a long time since I've done an online teaching session, but it's a good reminder, you know, because I should have chunked up the presentation. I should have asked for reactions and that kind of, you know, test of how things were going at different points in that presentation. So absolutely, you get through much less. So that does then, as Rose, I think, is suggesting, you know, change the balance in terms of what you're doing, whether you want to go, you know, fully to the flipped classroom kind of idea, I don't know, is something to think about. But think about, you know, what kind of materials you can be providing to students in terms of kind of reading, watching short videos, listening to something, doing an activity, you know, how they can do that before you come to a session where you might have that greater interaction. So I think a flipped classroom approach, whether, you know, in full or in part, I think is a good way to approach it.
Okay, and just shows the global reach of these sessions in the chat box from Satadeepa, who writes, I'm from India and I teach in a government-aided college. So far I've been recording lectures and uploading them on Google Drive so that students are able to download these lectures. And do you think I should hold online discussion sessions, doubt clearing sessions too, instead of sending recorded lectures? What's the balance to get right there, Georgina?
Absolutely, and you know, I do feel for everybody, because as I say, you know, the OU has 2 years to do this kind of stuff, and we're trying to do it in 2 months. You know, so I do think we do need to sort of think about what's doable, what's practicable, and, you know, distinguish that from what we might like to do if we had a bit more time. So I would, you know, if at all possible, try and avoid sort of the long lecture. Not the least because I think we, you know, very few of us do that in a face-to-face setting now. You know, very few people now just kind of stand up at the front and talk to their students for an hour. You know, the good lectures are all about sort of, you know, having information giving for 10, 15 minutes and then having some kind of interaction, whatever that might be and however you might do that. So think about how you would then emulate that in an online setting. So, you know, think about chunking your lecture and after sort of 10 or 15 minutes saying to your students, okay, let's have a pause now, you know, go and walk round, stretch your, you know, you can build in sort of health and well-being tips into your lectures as well. You know, say to your students, okay, get up from your desk or table or wherever you might be and just have a stretch and then come back and listen to the next instalment. You know, try and think of it like that. But yeah, you know, there aren't, whilst I would say, you know, think about the blend, think about those sort of chunking things as much as possible, you also have to be able to do what's practicable and what's practical for your students as well. So, you know, think it through, try and think it through as well, not just in terms of your module, but how it might fit in with other modules that students might be studying. So sort of take that step back and think holistically about their kind of their year, their program of study, if you can. Sorry, okay. I got a bit excited there and a bit off topic, so bring me back if I didn't answer it properly.
Okay, I'll bring you actually on to a question now about design. So a question from Thomas. How can we ensure that what we're creating as lecturers has a long shelf life? Obviously, we're doing stuff as an emergency at the moment, and it's, you know, we're putting a lot of effort into it. But how can we try and ensure that some of the effort we're putting in is going to create things that will still be useful next year or beyond that?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. And, you know, thinking back to the OU experience, the OU tries to build modules that last for 10 years, which of course is really hard, particularly if the subject is politics. So try and not refer to things in your materials that will date it. Easier said than done within a discipline like politics, but try and use devices that can teach your students what you want them to learn without it being tied to a particular event, a particular, you know, if you're teaching, I don't know, off the top of my head, teaching about prime ministers, for example, don't necessarily link it to a current prime minister. Think about what it is you want to teach about prime ministers and link it to kind of principles rather than a particular personality or a particular event, if that makes sense. The other thing to try and do, of course, is evaluate, you know, what we're doing now. I keep sort of trying to say to colleagues, and it's very hard because we're all kind of like, oh, trying not to panic and in this sort of maelstrom of change. But try and kind of hang on to and note down somewhere the lessons that you've learnt, you know, and the things that, you know, by having to do this quickly, you know, actually there are things now that colleagues are already saying to me, I don't know why we didn't do it like this before. This is much better, you know, and that goes from kind of how you interact with colleagues and meetings, things like that, to how you interact with students and how you teach students. So try, if you can, whether it's something like, you know, reflective journal or a document, perhaps, you know, a wiki that you put together with colleagues. When you have those kind of eureka moments and you think, oh God, yeah, this is a really good way of doing things. Why didn't we do it before? You know, record that, write it down somewhere, because otherwise the tendency is when you come out of this kind of situation, which at some point, hopefully we will, you kind of quickly just go back to doing things in the old way just because it's nice and it's familiar and it's comfortable, and we kind of lose the lessons we've learned. So to go back to the question, you know, try and evaluate what you're doing and what works, and try and then sort of at least keep some of that when we get back to a different situation.
Okay, another question just around design, instructional design. Vanessa asking about learning styles. How can we ensure that we're creating something that works for students with a range of different learning styles? I can imagine that if you've got 6 modules and everyone does everything the same, it could be a bit sort of death by Microsoft Teams and online PowerPoint.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the first point that I make. It's about variety. It's about the blend, and, you know, doing different, sort of using different materials, delivering them in different ways, and trying to kind of appeal to those different learning styles of students. You won't get it right all the time, you know, and some students will hate some of what you do. I know that was the case with one of the modules that the entry-level module that I worked on at the Open University. We had a module trigger at the start that began on the street, and we used the street as a way to teach students about social science inquiry, about kind of finding out about sort of the world around them. And it was a bit like Marmite. Some students loved it, other students hated it and couldn't wait to get off the street. So yeah, you know, students do like different things, and as long as I think you have a blend and you're not just doing the one thing over and over again, then that's fine. I suppose the other thing that I would say, and I'm conscious that we haven't really done this sufficiently at Huddersfield, and I'm aware that it's something that we need to do, is to consult with your students as much as possible. You know, use your existing students and say, look, this is what we're planning. I think we've been quite good at Huddersfield at communicating with our students kind of in that sort of emergency period, in terms of, you know, this is what we're doing to kind of get you through the year, to change your assessments, to kind of get you where you need to be. Now I think we kind of need to move away from that sort of temporary emergency measure, and actually start to involve students and say, look, this is how we think it's going to work, this is what we're going to offer to you, you know, and get them to sort of be part of that solution as much as possible. Some of that might be uncomfortable, because some of it might be turning around to students and saying, no, we can't do that actually, you know, if they have something that they want that you actually just can't do. But I think involving them as much as you can is really helpful. Obviously that'll be continuing students rather than new students, but what you can do with new students is communicate as much as possible sort of from the start. And I think we're probably, I don't know how other kind of institutions feel, we're struggling with that a bit at the moment at Huddersfield, I think, about getting that balance right between communicating with students when actually there are so many unknowns that you're not quite sure what you're going to say in your communication. It's a really difficult thing, but I know kind of from a student viewpoint, they're anxious for any kind of communication at the moment, even if you're not able to kind of give necessarily the concrete answers that they want.
Okay, and time for one very quick last question, Georgina. PSA does a lot of work to support early career academics. We've had a particular question coming through from Thomas around what can we do to support GTAs next year, and how can we get them involved in teaching online and supporting this sort of delivery? Yeah,
absolutely crucial. We use GTAs at Huddersfield actually in a very specific way that might be different to perhaps Russell Group institutions. So it'd be interesting to know kind of how they use. We don't necessarily use them as kind of direct teachers, if that makes sense. We actually use GTAs at Huddersfield to provide that interface between students and lecturers. Kind of on the grounds that they're sort of closer to the student body. You know, they've sort of just come out of that experience. Our GTAs are very recent undergraduates. They've just come out of that student experience, and they can kind of provide that bridge between the two worlds. So we use our GTAs very much around kind of settling in, dealing with students who might be struggling to interact in seminars, you know, all that kind of thing. So from a Huddersfield perspective, we see them as absolutely essential in terms of providing some of that informal support and encouraging students to interact, to come along to drop-in sessions around assignments, things like that, when they might feel reluctant to engage with an academic. You know, I think we tend to forget about that power relationship that academics have with students. We tend to think, well, I haven't got any power, I'm just a cog in the machine. But actually from a student viewpoint, the person who marks your work, you know, has significant power over you. So we use GTAs very much in that interface between the two. So for us, they're absolutely essential. If you're an institution that uses them in a much more traditional sense of kind of conducting seminars and lectures and things like that, my advice would be pretty much in line with what I've just said about students. Involve your GTAs very early on, because they'll have some great ideas about how you can move your teaching online. So think about them in terms of, you know, the ideas they've got for encouraging interaction in online environments. You know, they'll have some absolutely great ideas, I'm sure. And it comes back to that element of critical peer review. You know, it's the reason that I would argue why OU materials are so good is because they're produced by teams. You know, they're not produced by one person, they're produced by a team of academics working together. So whilst, you know, we can't really have the luxury of that team working on something for 2 years, we can recreate it to some extent and think about how we can use buddies, mentors to really get that element of critical peer review and point out the gap in your materials or what you're doing that you yourself just can't see. You know, we all sort of feel that, I'm sure, you know, in many situations. So I think that's why it's so important, and GTAs could be very useful in that role.
Okay, thanks. That's all the questions. Donna, back over to you then.
Thanks, John, and thank you so much, Georgina, for such a great session, and thank you all for coming. The recorded session will appear on our website shortly, and we'll also send you a feedback email. do spread the word about the webinars. They're open to anyone to attend, not just PSA members. And please do continue the discussion online, on Twitter in particular, especially if your question, we didn't get round to it. The next session's on Thursday, the 4th of June at 3 o'clock, hosted by Christina Reston-Bandera from the University of Leeds, on scaffolding learning, how to guide and engage your students into online learning. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you all.
Thanks, Georgina. It was fantastic.
See you.